Hi, if you're watching this video, you're watching the first lesson in the water unit. In this unit, we'll be focusing on water and its importance to the earth, importance to life, and how it affects the geography as well as the climate of the planet. So, how much of Earth is covered in water, right? You definitely have seen pictures of the planet Earth before, but what proportion of the planet is actually water? Well, 71% of the entire globe is covered in water, right? And so the majority of Earth is covered in water. Well, then, how much of it is salt water? Because you know you shouldn't be drinking water from the ocean, right? Because it's salt water. Well, then, how much of that water is actually salty? Well, the amount of water on Earth, 97% of that water is salt water. So of the 71% of the total Earth coverage, right, that's water, 97% of that is salt water. So 97% of the water on Earth is salt water, right? That leaves a very small amount of water that's fresh. And water is considered fundamental for life. All life that we know of requires water to survive. And we as humans need fresh water especially. So when we go back to this picture and we say 71% of the world is covered in water and 97% of that water is salt water, that leaves only 3% of the available water as fresh. Right? So even though the entire world is covered in water, a very small amount of it is actually fresh and drinkable. And again, water is fundamental for all life. Right? Scientists, biologists have yet to discover anything that doesn't require water. So this video will talk about how we use water and processes other than drinking in which water is important. Well, where do we find that precious water? What are some examples of where fresh water can be found? So pause the video and try and think of examples of where we can find fresh water because it's that important, right? Life, us, we couldn't exist without water. So where do we get fresh water? Okay, hopefully you paused the video and came up with a few ideas of where we would find fresh water. There are three main sources of fresh water. Now, most of you probably thought lakes and rivers, but only 0.3% of all fresh water is found in lakes and rivers. So the vast majority of the water that we drink isn't actually coming from lakes and rivers, right? 70% of fresh water is found in glaciers, right? And 30% is found underground. So when you look at a river and lake, yeah, they're fresh water, but that only makes up a very small percentage of the fresh water on Earth, right? The majority of it is found frozen in ice. In this video, we'll talk about the different types of fresh water and where they're found. So now we know that humans need fresh water to survive. We also know that only about 3% of the world's water is fresh, and even less is readily available, right? You can't just go find a glacial and drink it, right? You need to process that water. You need to melt that water. You need to make it accessible, right? Water found underground, well, you got to dig for it. You got to find it underground. Only 0.3% of fresh water you can just pick up and drink. And even then, you'd probably need to clean it. So the vast majority of fresh water is very limited and is in limited supply. So it's very important to understand the importance of fresh water and importance to its impact to our society, because without it, we wouldn't exist. So this video talks about some ways we waste water, but before you take a look at it, think of some ways in which we waste water. So pause the video, think about ways in which human beings in general waste water. Hopefully you paused the video. So you probably thought of like taking extra long showers or pouring water away or just dumping water in general, right? we waste water regularly. We use water in paper. We use water in manufacturing. We use water of course, when we shower. So many of us, me included, take very long showers, and that's a huge waste of water on a daily basis, right? So we are constantly using up our fresh water in ways in which we don't need to, or in amounts that is unreasonable, and we're running out of fresh water. So how does water move around? And you've probably done this in grade 4 and 5, and you've talked about the water cycle, right? You've talked about precipitation or rain, or water hits the ground or lake or river. And you've talked about evaporation, right? Where heat from the sun or the environment causes water to go back into a gas and leave the body of water or the land and go back into the air and then condense back into clouds and rain. And in biology, we talked about transpiration, right? Basically evaporation from plants. And all of these things work together to create water cycling, right? It goes down into the ground, into rivers and bodies of water, back up into the air, and then back down again. And so this is called the water cycle. And naturally, you can already assume why it's so important. It's how water gets from point A to point B, right? It's why water is found everywhere in the world. So the water cycle is able to move from place to place, right? So evaporation is how water rises into the air. As mentioned before, evaporation is when water is heated up and changes state into a gas. So if you remember from chemistry, this is a physical change. And when the water enters the air and becomes a gas, it condenses back into clouds, right? It'll condense into clouds, and then the cloud will rain that water down. Another physical change. We're changing from liquid to gas, gas to liquid as it falls down. The clouds move around because of air currents, right? Clouds constantly move around because air is pushing those clouds around. So as water evaporates and forms clouds, air or wind is pushing those clouds in other directions and causing water to be spread around the area rather than just falling out from the same spot. Right? So as clouds move over land, they drop their water as precipitation. And this can be in the form of rain or snow or anything in between. As the water falls down, it flows into rivers as runoff, right? So runoff is when the river basically runs off, right? Runs off into the ocean or runs down the slope. Or the water from the rain can enter underground reservoirs and become groundwater, right? And groundwater and rivers can eventually or will eventually flow back into the ocean. And again, evaporation, condensation, back through. And it just keeps cycling. Right? So basically, this was an introduction to the water system, the water cycle, and the importance of water. Please watch these videos because they're actually very good at showing you how we waste water, how we use water, and the water cycle. Right? So hopefully you found this useful, and I'll see you next lesson.